Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. The West likes to dismiss the BRICS alliance as a political sideshow, but is it starting to crack the U.S.-led global order? Let's get to the bottom line. Next week, the group of countries known as the BRICS meet in Russia for its annual summit. After the Alliance of Emerging Economies expanded last year, these 9 countries now represent a bigger slice of global wealth than the G7, the main economic group of the United States and its junior partners. Population-wise, BRICS represents about 5 times more people around the world than these G7 nations, and it literally has 40 countries knocking on its door to join. But what power does it really have? And can the BRICS pose a challenge to America's grip on global dominance and the global economy, even if it wanted to? Today, we're talking with Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and author of more than a dozen books on the global economy, including Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Richard, it's a real honor to have you on the show today. And I want to just ask you, like, point blank, BRICS, is it a real new thing that's going to challenge the American global order, or is it still an illusion?
Well, the short answer to your question is it's a real thing, not an illusion. It's already challenged the order that was dominated by the United States, and it promises to continue to do so. It certainly is as we are speaking. It is only wishful thinking on the part of the major countries of what we used to call the collective West, or maybe should still call it. It's a self-delusion on the part of the West to minimize it, to brush it off. Really is a new world order that we are living through. And I believe many of the problems, many of the tensions, many of the hostilities we are in the midst of, as you and I are speaking, are derivative from, are shaped by the challenge posed by the BRICS.
So when I look at this group of nations, it's hard for me to understand, what do they represent? What are they for in terms of, I know that they may be against American dominance, but what are they collectively for?
They should not be thought of as some sort of monolith. They aren't. But they share that the highest priority they have is to emerge from the state of underdevelopment, less development, whatever language you find comfortable. These are countries that don't yet have the standard of living of the United States and who do not accept the notion that they can't or mustn't or shouldn't aspire to at least the same standard of living, if not, in fact, a higher standard. And they want the freedom and they want the opportunity to do so. And now the tension. They feel that the United States, with its major allies, the G7, that is Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, those 7 have held them back, first as colonies, and secondly as pariahs, as nations that are hemmed in by all kinds of restrictions. That is what's unacceptable. That is what they agree on, and that's where the rub with the G7 emerges.
Now, I want to ask you a complex question about the dollar. Why can't there be a challenge on that status tomorrow? Why can't rubles or the yuan or, the currencies in Brazil, et cetera, be bundled together, which I understand is part of the objective of the BRICS? But why is there such primacy of the dollar?
Well, it's been the case, as you correctly point. It's been the case basically since the end of World War II. And if I may, let me suggest the importance of historically understanding what we're doing here, what situation that we are in. At the end of World War II, all of the countries that might have been competitors of the United States in terms of their economic power, their influence on the world, their importance in the flows of trade and money, all of the potential competitors, and we can list them: Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia. All were destroyed by the war. By contrast, the United States emerges after having a war, but the war helped the American economy. People have to remember we were in a deep depression, the greatest depression capitalism has ever suffered. From 1929 to 1940-41, when World War II gets underway, this economy, the US, was depressed. In 1933, we had a 25% unemployment rate. 1 out of 4 workers had no work. And this affected every family in the country. So we came out of the Great Depression by means of World War II. We took half of the millions who were unemployed and put them in a uniform, and the other half of the unemployed went to work making the uniforms and the guns and the ships and the planes and all the rest. And so we came out of the war. Yes, we suffered loss of troops who fought. That was certainly significant, but not comparable to what happened in those other countries. But we had an intact economic system. Other than Pearl Harbor, no bomb fell on the United States for the rest of the war. And so there was no contest. We were king of the hill. We, the U.S., was dominant. If you're going to conduct trade, you better use the dollar, because that was the only thing you could be sure was valuable alongside of gold. And so the dollar became the international symbol as well as the real transactional material to get your economy going again. So that by the end of the 20th century, it had become the norm, as you rightly say, for central banks around the country to hold dollars as well as gold as the reserve banking their currency. And the easiest way for Americans to grasp what the dollar as international currency means is to think very simply. Here's how it goes. A foreign country sends the United States the fruits of its labor, wine from France, electrical equipment from Japan, copper from Africa, whatever. And we send them little green pieces of paper, the dollar, the $10 bill, the $100 bill, which costs absolutely nothing to produce. It's a cheap piece of paper. They accept the paper, and we get the produce. Wow. They agree. Normally, with other countries, they're not going to send you their produce, the products of their industry, unless you send an equivalent to them. It's an exchange. And in many cases, we still do that here in the United States with other countries. But if you have the dollar and the world wants it, you basically get something for nothing. The world holds the dollar, satisfied with that, because they need it for their currency support, and we get the fruit of other people's labor without having to give anything of our own in exchange. It's an extraordinary power, and guess what? Other countries would like to participate.
Let me ask you about the BRICS versus the G7. Isn't this, in a way, a bit of a charade, where the dominant behemoth power in the G7 is the United States, and the dominant behemoth power in the BRICS is China? And you hear about Brazil, you hear about Russia, you hear about India, but I mean, I'm just wondering whether these two gargantuans are sort of hiding the fact that we're in a, essentially a G2 world of China and the United States at odds, negotiating and masking what they're doing. How do you look at China versus the United States versus the G7 versus BRICS?
No, you're absolutely right. I don't know if I would use the word hiding, although I understand why you do that. It is a diplomatic politeness. You don't point out that you're the bigger of the partners in a deal. It's a polite, everybody knows, but you kind of don't say it. So let me first say you're right. The United States is the overwhelming dominant player among the G7, and China is the unquestioned equal dominant under the BRICS. All right, let's start with Russia, because it's a big, important player. The GDP of Russia last year in the neighborhood of, say, $2 trillion. These are rough measures, so it's the order of magnitude. That's all you have to keep in your mind. What is the comparison with the United States? The United States GDP this last year about 24, 25 trillion. So you understand Russia is 2 trillion, the United States 24, 25 trillion. No contest. No one should ever imagine that either the Soviet Union in the past or Russia now is some kind of economic competitor of the United States. Never was, isn't now. Only the hype of the Cold War would make one think like that, and that's something you should correct if you've never had it explained to you. Now let's move to China. What's the GDP last year of China? Again, there are lots of debates about how you count it, but order of magnitude, 17, 18 trillion dollars. Way more important than Russia, but still not the size of the United States, although it's catching up. And most people believe at current rates of economic growth, China will surpass the United States by the end of this decade. And it has been catching up. Let's remember, 50 years ago, which in historical time is a moment, 50 years ago, China was among the poorest countries on earth. And now it is the only country in the world even close to the United States, and as I say, catching up. So China dominates. Russia, Brazil, India. India, by the way, is doing remarkably well. The problem is they have a poverty-stricken mass that is holding them back, and until they can do something about that, which they still have a long way to go, they will not be equivalent to China either.
Right.
So China is, you correctly see, the new thing for the United States. And what do I mean? It's the first real economic competitor that the United States has had in a century. That's why it's so hard for Americans, including our leaders, to adjust, as the whole world must now, to this reality that the dominance of the United States is over, and there is no prospect that I can see for it to come back.
So let me ask you, Richard, about your view of the U.S. elections. Right now we have a ragingly high stock market. We have very low unemployment. But if you go out and talk to Americans, there's a lot of anxiety out there when a lot of the, surface data are pretty good. And I think Kamala Harris is running on that. And she's running against someone who's running on populist economics. So I'm interested in how you see these choices. We're going to have an election here in a couple of weeks. And do you think I framed it correctly?
Well, I would go further. Let me give you some other numbers. We have a greater degree of inequality in our economy than we have had for 50 years. The equality that came out of the Great Depression, the New Deal, that was remarkable about the United States. At the end of World War II, the United States was less unequal than all of our allies in Europe. Today, it's reversed. We're more unequal than all of our allies in Europe. What happened? We cut taxes on corporations. We exported huge quantities of the best paying jobs in manufacturing, which we don't have anymore. I could give you a long list of symptoms, of data, of realities that suggest this economy has got huge problems. And so here's the difficulty. There are people in our country who are enjoying the good things. And then there are people in our country who are excluded from the good things. Let's remember, for example, that the 10% richest Americans own about 90% of the stocks. So when you're saying the stock market is doing well, it is good news for those 10%, no question. But for the other 90%, they're watching the 10%, but they're not included in that happy experience. So they feel deprived, neglected, and there begin you can see where Trump's support can begin to develop. The idea we want to go back, MAGA, we want to go back. Well, because the present isn't looking very good, and the prospects for their children in large parts of the United States are pretty grim, if you're going to be honest about it. So we shouldn't be surprised if you don't distribute the good news equally across the society. You're going to get the results that we are now watching in
Right.
terms of the closeness of this election.
Well, that discontent that you just described also seems to echo in what we're hearing from the BRICS, that there's sort of, all around the world, you sort of see this boiling discontent. I think it's hard to know sometimes when that infrastructure falls and is replaced, by those that have that discontent. But it's very interesting. I would be remiss, Richard, if I didn't ask you to share your thoughts on the Middle East as well. I mean, you've been essentially, in my view, a cold, hard realist on economics, beyond morality, beyond politics, look at the economics of things and be a realist in telling that story. When you look at today the crisis in the Middle East we see unfolding, Israel and this broadening crisis in the Middle East, and America kind of acquiescing to a lot of this, I'd love to get your thoughts and insights on where you see this going.
Yeah, I try to be realistic. I try to look at the data. I try to give a balanced view in all of these things. So let me try a little bit there. If you ask for the big picture, the way you opened our conversation by looking at the large geopolitical framework within which to think about these things, then I would have to say that much of what the United States has been doing, including its support for what Israel is doing, that these strike me as unfortunate, I'm choosing my words carefully, attempts by the G7, the West, whatever you want to call it, unfortunate efforts to hold on to a position that simply is no longer historically available to them. I understand it. Look, the American empire is shrinking. If you have a historical sense, you would have known that the special position I described a few moments ago that comes out of World War II with the United States sitting on top, that can't be sustained. It never has been in human history. No empire lasts forever. Every empire rises out of particular circumstances, evolves over time, and then passes away. The United States emerged as the dominant player in the world. I mean, look, we have 700 to 800 military bases around the world right now. No other country has anything remotely like that. That's a reflection of our empire. You can put whatever fancy words you want around it, but that's what this is. And it had no chance of surviving forever. It would eventually fade away like every other empire. And that's a very difficult experience for Americans, just as we can watch over the previous century, the poor British had to go through the loss of their empire, which is now absolutely gone from them. We are now, our empire peaked, and we are on the way down, and that is, and we try to hold on. We don't want the Russians to tell us they can take a piece of Ukraine back into Russia. And we don't want our ally, our friend in the Middle East, Israel, to be in any way held back from what it wants to do. These are our allies. That is our enemy. We want to hold it, but we can't. We can't. And this bitter lesson, look, the honesty, and I know this is difficult for Americans. We lost the war in Vietnam. It's now the Communist Party that runs that country. We lost the war in Afghanistan. It's the Taliban that runs that country. We lost the war in Iraq. I mean, I could go on, but the lesson should become plain to people. We can't do it Israel is a country of a few million people, is not going to control and run the Middle East. It can't do that with or without the United States. It can drive people crazy. It can produce unspeakable outcomes. And to take off my realist economist hat for a minute, what these are war crimes. War crimes are defined when you kill civilians. A war is supposed to be a military against the military, and we went through a lot of trouble in the 20th century, in World Wars I and II, to come up with a war crimes definition and an international court that can identify and try to stop war crimes. That's when you kill large numbers of civilians. It doesn't matter what the excuse is, you can't.
Right.
So yeah, the Hamas people on the October last year killed civilians. That's a war crime. That doesn't mean I don't understand why Palestinians would be resisting the dominance and the growth of Israel. I understand why they would. I think Israelis understand why they would.
Right.
And then the one killing of civilians over the last year by Israel, for me, indefensible as a war crime, as the International Court has said it is a war crime and castigated Mr. Netanyahu. But for me, the bigger picture is that these are efforts to hold on. Israel is a kind of settler colonialism. It's when Europeans come and push out the local people, pretend they aren't there. That's that notion, a people without land, the Jews, are going to a land without people. Yeah, there's a lovely story. It's a lovely parallel, but it isn't true. There were people there. We know the story. We're Americans. Europeans came here, got rid of the local population, and the few of them that are left are stuck in reserves. Where Israel is going is in that direction. But the problem is, that was centuries ago when you could do that. You can't do that now. You cannot, and the world is isolating Israel. And what I see is a very, very unhappy end for Israel in making this sad effort to hold on when the only possibility is working out a live and let live arrangement with your neighbors.
So much to think about. I really want to thank you, renowned economist and author Richard Wolff. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me, and my appreciation for having these conversations. United States, in which I was born and lived all my life, needs it now more than ever.